Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Pensacola. And I'm Nancy Hagman, and I'll be your service leader for today. We welcome you if this is your first time for being here, or second or third, or many, many times of being here. Time has a way of making its own decisions, and so we welcome you for being here and glad you're here today. We have a few announcements before we start. There are a couple, fall always kicks off some new things for us, and In Gathering was in September, and frequently at this point in time we do some things that are repeated based on the energy of the people in the congregation willing to do them. And so we have a couple of things happening. We will have a blood drive, and so watch for the blood drive. We will also have a trunk or treat. And so there are sign-ups on the credenza for trunks and door prizes and baked items. If you have any questions, Chris Brockway is in charge of the trunk or treat, and I suspect she's also in charge of the blood drive. The next announcement, today at 11:30, Just Pensacola, gathering from our congregation, considered a house meeting, will meet here in the sanctuary. You can learn about Just Pensacola, and it's we call it JUUST, they call it JUST. There will be snacks provided for those that stay and engage and enjoy together. Paula Montgomery and Penny Featherstone will answer questions at that time. And you have something you need to say, Paula?
No, I was just
okay. Paula, raise your hand, and Penny, and they will be available for questions at 11:30. This week, the Mountain Retreat Center will have UU Women's Spirit, and if you have any questions, you're welcome to see Patty Featherstone. Next week, we will have a maiden voyage. Barbara Wright, a relatively new member to our community, will present her first service to our community, which is really exciting. It's wonderful to have new people come and dive in. She will be talking about courage. Courageous people change the world. So many examples of that occur and are reflected in October. Celebrations throughout the month that reoccur, including Mohandas Gandhi, who was born on October 2nd, which I think might be today. Happy birthday. And a lot of Christian friends celebrate Reformation Day and Martin Luther King. And we rightly honor these giants, but the problem most of us feel that we're not quite that tall. And the question she poses, perhaps we are. And next, I believe we have a slide. We are going to have a camp out again. It's been years. We camped out in our houses for a long time, right, during a posed camp out at home where we grilled out on our own grills and ate our own food and never left the house. And now we're going to have it where we can share with each other. It'll be October the 14th through 16th. It'll be held at the Vincent's family property in Century. So it's a private property, and it's about 40 minutes from here, not far at all. There'll be fun, food, fellowship, and there'll be lots of activities for the kids as well. And kids are ranged age from birth to 99. Laura Keith King and Denise Gunn and Bradley and Joe Vinson are heading that up and coordinating it. Denise will be in the foyer following the service, and there'll be sign-up sheets, and if you have any questions, Denise has her hand raised over here. So come and bring a friend. I'm assuming also that we will probably have some day activities that if you choose just to go, if you think the ground is hard, or you think there isn't a good place for your little body to be rejuvenated at night, then you're welcome to come for day activities. I believe that it will also be over in time for Sunday morning for you to be here with us again in this space. And now we will have a meditation song. And we will have some chalice lighting words. At times, our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us has cause to think with deep gratitude of those who have lighted the flame within us. Now we'll have some opening words. Exile of memory. Do not return. We were warned by one who knows things that you will only upset the dead. They will emerge from the spiral of little houses lined up in the furrows of marrow and walk the land. There will be no place in memory for what they see. The highways, the houses, the stories of interlopers, perched on the blood fields where the dead last stood. And then what? You with your words in the enemy's language. Do you know how to make a peaceful road through human memory? And what of angry ghosts of history? Then what? Don't look back. In Sunday school, we were told Lot's wife looked back and she turned to salt. But her family wasn't leaving paradise. We loved our trees and waters, and the creatures, and the earths, and the skies, in that beloved place. Those beings were our companions, even as they fed us and cared for us. If I turn to salt, it will be of petrified tears from the footsteps of my relatives as they walked west. And now if you'll stand for our covenant and remain standing for our opening hymn. Love is the spirit of this church, and service our all. This is our covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And you can turn in your hymnal to number 113.
Where is our hope?
So we will turn now to our time of giving to our church. We often give our time and talents. We have many people that share their wealth of energy and their wealth of knowledge to our congregation, as well as financially supporting this congregation. And so we'll pass the basket at this time. If you have any joys or concerns or sorrows that you would like to have announced, please put them in the basket. I'd like to light the first candle for Laura Keith King, who is sick today and unable to be with us. She's our choir director and also president of this congregation. However, she made her presence obviously in one of the music presentations, and she was singing there and brought herself into our service, and so that was wonderfully planned and timed, and we appreciate it having her with us also. Penny Featherstone would like to have a candle lit for, she and her wife Melissa have 4 siblings and spouses and children and grandchildren that were hit by the hurricane. Ian, although I heard on the announcement it was called Ian and Ian. I don't know who knows what they're saying on the TV, but it obviously is Ian in my mind. While all of them are safe, of course, having been through a hurricane, we know the aftermath and what that requires for several years. Philip Rawls would like a candle for his best friend, David Jackson. They've been friends for over 30 years, and he's been diagnosed with multiple cancers, and the oncologist is hopeful, successfully addressed specifically the surgeries. Would like prayers and healing energy would be greatly appreciated. And UED has identified that we have a new sign at the back entrance on Old Halifax. I'm not sure that I've seen that new sign, so perhaps I'll go look at that new sign. And we'll light one candle for those thoughts and prayers and warm wishes that we have on our hearts. And now I'm pleased to introduce Scott Satterwhite. He's a longtime, he has lots of credentials after his name, but in my mind he has the most powerful is what he has learned and accepted in his life and what he has the privilege of sharing in the world of social justice. And if you leave here today disturbed, I think that he will have been successful. And I welcome him. He's a longtime member of our congregation. Thank you. Come, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. I'm here to disturb, so get ready. All right, so let me see if this works. Yeah, wrong way. Okay. All right. So my talk is about adapting to a new world, and I gave it that title as a little bit of a kind of tongue-in-cheek is the right word, but a little bit of irony in here, because of course when people talk about the Americas, they often would talk about the Americas as a new world, when of course it's not. It's been around for quite some time, and there's a lot of folks over here before. So often when people give talks about anything that has to do with Native Americans or indigenous rights, there's an acknowledgement, a land acknowledgement, And I often have a slide for this, but I didn't put up a slide for it. But just to acknowledge that we're on stolen land that's from the Creek Nation. And prior to that, there are other folks that were here before. But the Creeks were the ones who were forced off of this land by Jackson and the Indian Removal Act and many, many other things. My mom and I recently went to Oxford, Mississippi, and there's a sign outside of Oxford, or inside the city, that gives a little history of the city. And I only read the first sentence of this thing, so I can't give you the whole history. But the first sentence said, the city was founded in the 1830s as a result of the Chickasaw cessation. And it's like, you look at that, it's like, what is that? So for people that don't know what a cessation is, which is probably many people who are going by reading that sign, they would just think that was just passed on, like the Chickasaws were done with that land and were happy to go move off into Oklahoma. But this is not the case. So you can look into some of that history, but where that history begins ultimately is with Columbus. So we're going to talk about Columbus, and we'll talk about Indigenous Peoples Day, and that stuff. So I also wanted to acknowledge the poet that Nancy read. It's Joy Harjo. Joy Harjo is a Native American poet. She was here last year, maybe the year before, as a guest of UWF. And she is the Poet Laureate of the United States. Pretty big deal for UWF to get her over here, but virtually, I should say, because it's during the pandemic. But an incredible poet. If you have the opportunity, you should read as much of her work as you can. Right. So the first Columbus Day recognition, and the recognition of Columbus Day was back in 1792 in New York, but it didn't really take on a federal recognition until about a century later. 11 Italian immigrants were lynched in New Orleans, which caused great stir among Italian Americans throughout the country and caused an international incident between the U.S. and Italy. To placate the Italian community in this country, as well as the consulate, President Benjamin Harrison called for the establishment of Columbus Day to honor one of Genoa, Italy's famous sons, Christopher Columbus. And that's worth pausing just for 1 second to think of the many, many other lynchings that happened that didn't get national holidays right afterwards, and not to denigrate, that one. But it's interesting just to see this, and also interesting to remember that the holiday didn't actually start with a remembrance of Columbus, but had something else in the background. The holiday took some time to catch on, though. Franklin Roosevelt made the first strong move to make Columbus Day a federal holiday, but the internment of Italian Americans slowed this down. After the heavy lobbying of the Italian American organizations, the Knights of Columbus in particular, which isn't necessarily Italian American, but has a heavy Italian American presence, the Johnson administration signed legislation that made Columbus Day a federal holiday, with the first to be celebrated in 1971, the year before I was born. Although I have lived in a country with Columbus Day for my whole life, I don't remember anyone thinking much of it. Had a lot of Italian friends, but I don't remember anyone in particular getting excited about Columbus Day. Other holidays such as St. Patrick's Day, or when I moved to Texas, Dia de Seis, which is Independence Day. This is the actual Independence Day. Many people think Cinco de Mayo is, but Dia de Seis is the real one. Dia de Seis in September, or Juneteenth were celebrated, but except for knowing the rhyme about Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492, I don't recall anyone doing anything in particular around Columbus Day except taking the day off. On October 12th, 1492, as you all likely know, Christopher Columbus sailed his vessels from Spain at the behest of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to find a route to the east. After months at sea, he and his crew finally landed on the island of Hispaniola, which is modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. According to his logs, Columbus and his men were greeted by the Arawak Indians, the Arawak people, who were unfortunately naive as to Columbus's intentions. Columbus drew his sword, and they grabbed the sword as if to shake hands, but were cut by the blade. According to Columbus, the Arawak people would make good slaves. And that's in his logs, his words. He hoped to find gold, but instead returned to the Spanish royal court with enslaved indigenous people. The slavery did not stop with these unfortunate people, but only began. The people on the island were said to number around 1 million in 1492. Within a few generations, the total indigenous population of the island had been decimated, literally decimated. True, many died of disease brought by the Spanish, but many died incredibly horrific deaths at the violence of Columbus's men. Enslaved Arawak people were forced to mine for mostly non-existent natural resources. If they returned without the required amount, punishment included chopping off the arms. Women were raped, mothers often killed their children and took their own lives so they did not have to suffer under Columbus and his men's reign of terror on the island. Columbus went on several more missions back and forth across the Atlantic, landing again in the Caribbean, Venezuela, and Central America, often moving indigenous people from their homelands, removing indigenous people from their homelands to various colonies for enslavement, where many died far away from their native lands. As the population of the islands were more than decimated, again, literally, Catholic officials urged a change in policy, recognizing the extreme cruelty under the Spanish conquest of the islands. The church agreed with the request not to abolish slavery, but to shift from Native Americans to Africans, leading to the African slave trade in the Caribbean, Central America, Mexico, and later what is now called the United States. This is also the legacy of Christopher Columbus. In fact, in 1559, when Don Tristan de Luna, you might know him, came to our area, he famously, at least famous here, I don't think anybody else outside of here knows him, but famously landed with approximately 500 Spanish soldiers. What's lesser known is that he also brought hundreds of enslaved Africans, including one woman named Guiomar, who was possibly de Luna's concubine, and we only know her name because it was on the bill of sale when he sold her in Cuba. But of significance, she's also probably the only, or the first African and possibly the first African-American woman or African woman that we actually know the name of, who is here, certainly in the city, but then even prior to that, too, so it's significant. But along with these Spanish and African people who were here, lesser known is that he also brought roughly 500 Aztec warriors from recently conquered Mexico, too. And to think of 500 Aztec warriors directly from Mexico and here in a pseudo-slavery relationship, and that's a little complicated, I can tell you about later, is pretty astounding. You try to imagine the area around Jerry's Drive-In, because that's where it was, around where Jerry's Drive-In is, what it must have looked like back then, with the 500 Aztec warriors, roughly around between 200 and 500 Africans, and as many Spanish people over there. So when we look at this and we think about the history of that time, usually it's told as a Spanish story, or we're celebrating the Spanish or our Spanish heritage, and leave out that this is also Aztec and this is also African, which makes the story more complicated because, of course, if you have to tell that part, well, why were the Aztecs here? Well, or why were the Africans here? Well, let's talk about the Spanish instead. So as well as all these soldiers here. But what's interesting, too, is when we think of this in our first settlement, there were even Aztec codices, and these are the codex. You might recognize these or might have seen these from Aztec drawings, but there's even Aztec codices about Pensacola. So even the Aztecs were writing about Pensacola. It's really interesting. You could look these up if you like. Yet, who is celebrated in this first settlement story? Europeans, pretty much solely the Europeans. Since the 2020 protests after George Floyd's murder, besides the dozens upon dozens of Confederate statues that were taken down, several Christopher Columbus statues were also removed across the country, as many drew the obvious connection between Columbus, the conquistadors, and this history. However, more still stand. Pensacola has a statue. Just out of show of hands, how many people know that Pensacola has a Christopher Columbus statue? See? It's even that, not terribly popular. So Pensacola has a Christopher Columbus statue that's placed in front of City Hall. It was there in the early 1990s to mark the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. While many clearly celebrated this event here and across the hemisphere, many also protested, like the folks back there. One of the first protest marches that I ever went on was led by Buddhist monks to monks to honor the victims of the genocide of the Native Americans since 1492. At the time, I was in the military, and my aunts, who were peace activists in the Catholic worker movement, invited me because I was heading to Japan, and I think they wanted to just plant a seed in my head before I went off overseas. The monks had marched from the Panama Canal and were heading to Washington, D.C. Think about that. That's a long walk. But they were going from the Panama Canal to Washington, D.C. And I met them at the Sarita checkpoint in South Texas and walked about a dozen miles with them that one day. Talking to people on this march gave me a vision of another worldview along with another view of history. Before that, I'd never heard of any opposition to Columbus celebrations. But as I mentioned earlier, I never heard of anyone actually caring about Columbus either. I didn't realize that so much of the historical narrative I'd grown up in was steeped in racial superiority and, frankly, a lot of lies, at the very least, lies of omission. A lot of my standard public history, I later realized, was not unbiased and omitted a large section of the stories of indigenous communities, especially when the history was uncomfortable. In fact, almost all of it was gone. After the military, I later walked with another group. Let me see if I can do that. Okay. I also walked with another group, ironically, with the exact same Buddhist monks, the exact same people, in a city that was also ironically named after the same explorer. You know where it is, Bill? Columbus, Georgia. An organization that I'm a part of, Veterans for Peace, marched for indigenous rights and an end to the militarization of the same lands the conquistadors attempted to conquer and subject. My friend Bill Sloan and I, and that's also Jamie Jones, he used to be the poet laureate here, and probably some of you know him too. My friend Bill Sloan and I participated in a procession carrying the names and crosses of people, many of whom were indigenous, murdered by repressive governments that the U.S. trained in the region that were part of the colonial legacy of Columbus. And also, I should mention, Lauren was there, Desmond was there as a baby, Maddie, wherever she is, and I'm sure many of you have also been to these two. Lots and lots of other people were over there too. Lots of people. To mark this colonial legacy of Columbus. Now, so from Christopher Columbus to Columbus, Georgia, marching for indigenous rights brought out an incredible group of human beings. It was here that I first heard of Indigenous Peoples Day as a holiday, but it was still hard to think that this would actually happen in my lifetime. Yet it's begun. In 2021, President Biden signed an order that made Indigenous Peoples Day a federal holiday. He did so while simultaneously keeping Columbus Day as a day to honor the contributions of Italian Americans. Yet this feels like southern states who acquiesce to pressure to create a holiday to celebrate Martin Luther King's birthday while also marking Robert E. Lee Day on the same day. Yes, that's true. Yet I understand the history of Columbus Day and its connections to the New Orleans lynchings. We should remember that day, of course, because it is an important day, and we should remember pretty much anybody who'd been killed, murdered through extrajudicial, often racial, ethnic lynchings, racial terrorism. But considering that few even know of that origin, the intention was lost, and now it's simply hurtful, especially Columbus Day specifically, especially when we recognize what happened only a few years prior. So as I mentioned earlier, Columbus Day was first enacted after the 1892 lynching of Italian Americans. Only 2 years before, in a place called Wounded Knee, the U.S. Army massacred 250 men, women, and children in one of the single most brutal attacks in U.S. history on any population. Was there a call to apologize or make amends? Yes, 100 years later. Congress passed a resolution expressing deep regret for the massacre. Yet no call for a national holiday came until the city of Berkeley, California, marked the first holiday during the 500th anniversary celebration year, changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Big changes have to start somewhere. Within just a few years, Berkeley's Indigenous Peoples Day spread to various cities in California and later across the country. Today, about a dozen states recognize some form of Indigenous Peoples Day, as well as the federal government now. Yet still, we have 50 states, and 12 is a small portion. But despite despite a long history of indigenous peoples in every single state of the Union. So how do we move forward with this change? First, we have to recognize that everything changes, including our narratives, nationally and personally. And I threw that part in there just to say that a lot of times people will push back against some of these changes, Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, because they're used to something. But as you can see, that Columbus Day hadn't even really been around that long. So the 100 years was just when it was first mentioned. But as far as the actual holiday celebrating is just 1 year before I was born. Like many of you, but it's also connected with this larger history of our stories. So like many of you, the tree of me has many roots. Overall, I'm mostly Irish, at least Irish American, which is different. If you go to Ireland and tell them that you're Irish, you'll get the side eye for sure, because they don't think you're Irish. But we have a history in this country that is pretty mixed. I have a little English in me too. People often ask about the name Satterwhite. There's a small town near England's Lake District called Satterwhite. That's the origin. But there's also another side to the family, the black side. This was apparently a secret in my family for a long time, that on my great-grandparents' side, my great-grandparents on my dad's side had passed as white, but were legally, quote-unquote, colored and mulatto. I'm using the terms from the census. Where does this put me in the mix? For years, I thought I was just Irish, and like a good Irishman, I never acknowledged the English in me. But then to find out in my adult years that there was a whole other side to my family that forced me to look even more deeply into America's complicated racial story, not only to understand the phenomenon of passing, but also what it means to re-examine your own story. I bring in my own personal background to say that as an adult, this caused a sea change in the way that I saw myself. I'm proud of all of these heritage, but can also look critically and objectively, or at least I try to. What I thought was one thing for a long time turned out to be something very different. Same with America. What you think is one thing might actually be very different. To be honest, I've never known anyone who had an attachment to Columbus Day. So maybe this is easy for me to say that the adjustment is perfectly fine. Possibly for those who have ancestors who are among the lynched in New Orleans, knowing their ancestors were the impetus for the holiday, the Italian Americans. There may be a disconcertation. You said the word. You can imagine what I'm saying. Might be problems over a change. I didn't get much sleep last night, so sorry. Just like a few years ago, we saw people standing strongly against the removal of the Confederate statue on Palafox. But again, things change. So maybe a better question should be, should we or should we not celebrate Columbus Day? So maybe a better question of should we or should we not celebrate Columbus Day? A better question would be, should we ask at what cost do we celebrate Columbus? Most of us are here because of Columbus. That's pretty much a fact. I say most, of course, not all, but most of us are here in some form or another because of Columbus. Nonetheless, that history is, to say the least, complicated. Some of my ancestors came voluntarily. Some, as I learned, came on slave ships as they came to a land that was already discovered by indigenous people of this continent. So if the original holiday became an event to console the people that were hurting after racial and ethnic violence in the South, I would argue that it's fitting to keep the Italian American Heritage Month, which actually is right now, which also incidentally overlaps with Hispanic Heritage Month and probably other months as well. But honoring the original people of this land simultaneously. Not only those who suffered untold numbers of lynchings, attacks, removals, violations, and genocide, as well as those who survived and are still here. And also I should mention that there is Native American Heritage Month, which is the following month, but it's a bit of a slap in the face to have this Columbus Day right there in this period. I have one example that to me summarizes the importance of recognizing this history and this heritage. In my daughter's kindergarten class, there is a cringeworthy celebration period that begins with Columbus Day and ends with Thanksgiving. And I think anyone who's conscientious about this subject has known the same weird feelings that start right around this period and then go all the way to the end of November. These weird feelings that continue still to this day. Seeing depictions of racialized Native Americans on the wall is something that was pretty common. She was even sent home with a coloring book that had a quote-unquote red Indian mixed into the story. The story is actually that Eric Carle book, if you might know that. Brown bear, what do you see? I see a tree looking at me or something, but it had this one part in there. They changed it around for Thanksgiving that said this one line, red Indian, what do you see? I see a pilgrim looking at me. So mixed into the story was just a pilgrim, somehow above race. I asked the teacher later on, so what if it said a white pilgrim? Bill, well, that would be weird. Okay. Why is this Indian racialized in this part right here? But then this is another conversation. So somehow this part was above race. The Native American was to be colored with a red crayon, but the pilgrim was above coloration somehow. Again, post-racial in this weird way. I talked to the teacher, but only for that one. I talked to the teacher about this, but the excuse was that the book was old, but they still used it. I suggested a change because it wasn't actually curriculum, just a coloring sheet, and predictably it was never quite the same between us, just like it is sometimes when you have an awkward racial moment with somebody. You bring it up and then from then on it's a little weird, but I still persisted. The following year though, I was contacted by a friend with the American Indian movement. I was contacted by a friend with the American Indian movement to help bring food to support a group of marchers who were walking to Washington, D.C., again, to raise awareness about diabetes in indigenous communities. They stopped at Fort Pickens to honor Geronimo, who was imprisoned by the U.S. Army there for a short time, probably a lot of you know that. And they asked if I could meet with them so I could help bring them some food. As we're riding out to Fort Pickens, I'm telling my daughter what we're doing and who we're meeting. Remember the same daughter who was in that class a little while ago. So I talked to my daughter and tell her what we're doing and who we're meeting. Her response when I said we were meeting people with the American Indian movement was, "Indians still exist?" This, despite having a roommate who claimed indigenous roots, but more importantly, her aunt being a member of the Chickasaw Nation as well as her cousin. While the lack of historical knowledge of a first grader certainly could be forgiven. And, I teach in college too. If you give anybody any kind of history things, then you get really disappointed very quickly. I can tell you a lot of stories about that. But so this could be forgiven with her, of course. But as just about any Americans lack historical knowledge. Still, what that told me was that for most of her class, who probably didn't get the post-classroom schooling about history, which is, again, probably most of these kids, the impression of 2 years in school was that Native Americans were extinct, which is argued, and this is actually a pretty gifted school and one of the ones that people really try to get into, which was arguably part of the plan all along. And I say arguably part of the plan, not necessarily of the school, but arguably of going back to Columbus, an extinction in here. So in this way that culturally, at least, this group of people, large group of people, 500 nations have been extinct, at least in the minds of some of the kids. So that put us on a little plan, a little talking plan after this. So our talk helped break that spell with my daughter, but more importantly, her meeting the people at Fort Pickens itself also helped. This just taught me that as society, that we as a society, but also as individuals, need to do better and recognize a few things. And this is us over at Fort Pickens with the people from the American Indian movement. Columbus did not discover America, nor was he the first non-indigenous person to arrive here. That would either be the Vikings or the Chinese, depending on the coasts that you're talking about. While his arrival brought about incredible changes in the world, many of these changes were clearly not good. Columbus's arrival brought about slavery. Columbus's arrival brought about genocide. Columbus's arrival brought about the extinction of languages and cultures. Columbus's arrival was the beginning of one world, the world that we live in, but it was also the end of another world, one that we will never truly know or understand because of the violence of conquest. Whether the ultimate thing that ended these lives, the lives of so many of those who met Columbus was, as Jared Diamond wrote, brought about by guns, germs, and steel, is largely academic, but also insignificant as the result was the decimation, again, literally using that word, the decimation, which means cutting pretty much everything out except for about 10% and even less than that. was the decimation of people and their cultures. And here, I'm specifically talking about Columbus and those he personally affected, but this could also be taken further, obviously. The movement to recognize Indigenous Peoples Day is relatively recent, but long overdue. So in my description of the talk, I said that I'd offer some ways that we can deal with the changing culture. And I'll just keep it limited to this specific subject. First, the basic one is just educate yourself. There's really no excuse for people who say they are ignorant to this subject but still hold fast to old beliefs. And I'm not saying that if you don't know this history that that there's no excuse, but for people to really hold on to these beliefs that we can't study or we can't change Columbus Day because whatever, then read this history and then you'll find out. I would just suggest reading the first chapter of The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Read that first chapter, and from then on I can never imagine possibly celebrating that day. But so again, there's no real excuse for that. But because there's a lot of stuff that's out there. Watch a documentary, read a book. If you can't read a book, you can listen to an audiobook. Lots of great Native American authors out there, fiction, poetry. We talked about Joy Harjo a second ago. Nonfiction, history, lots of stuff that's out there, lots of information. Turn off the radio one day on the way to work and just listen to the history in your car. The information is available and accessible. You just have to want to know it. And that's usually where the problem is, because a lot of people just don't want to feel uncomfortable. More importantly, I'd suggest contact. I feel it's largely been shown that people's beliefs change the more contact they have with others of different cultures. Ask questions, but more importantly, listen to others. Besides the Native American Heritage Center on Pensacola's west side, which you can look that up, it's off of, I forgot what the road is, I think it's Gulf Beach Highway, somewhere in that area. There's the Porch Creek Reservation just an hour from here in Atmore, Alabama. And as you can see in that small picture, I might not be able to see it too well, but it's part of a powwow that they do. They have a really great museum that's worth your time with great storytellers on the reservation. Also, every Thanksgiving, and that's of course on purpose, every Thanksgiving they also have an annual powwow. It's a pan-Indian gathering, meaning the tribes from across the Americas come to compete in various competitions, and it's a really great event, open to the public. I asked an elder once if it was okay to go there. He said, sure, he'll take your $5 admission charge, no problem. That event is really worth your time, so if you have the chance to go. We've been there with the family. That's Desmond when he was a little smaller hair too. And we brought my mom over there, who was just here just the other day. So it's highly recommended, and I just double checked to see if it's happening this year, and it is happening this year. So if you get the chance, you should go. It's worth your time. But even closer to home, in Pensacola, my friend Sean Lanezzo helped spearhead a small movement to recognize Indigenous Peoples Day here in this city. In fact, there will be a ceremony this year on what used to be called Columbus Day in front of City Hall. It's the third time that it happened. Where the 5 flags that normally fly over City Hall, France, England, Spain, Florida, and the U.S., will be lowered, and the flags of the so-called 5 civilized tribes, which are the Choctaw, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations, will be raised. And that's not a small thing. Even though it's a bit of a gesture, it means something. It's meaningful. So if you're wondering what you could do to help celebrate this day, I'd suggest 2 things. 1, attend that event, and 2, which might be even more important, contact your city council and the mayor himself, as well as the incoming mayor, to assure that this 3-year tradition becomes permanent. While this is obviously symbolic, symbols are very important. And for that, you can ask any son of a Confederate veteran, that organization, how they felt about taking down the statue. And they'll tell you they felt symbols were important. So symbols are important. They mean a lot to a lot of folks, both the removal and raising, of certain things. So they don't erase the past, all of these symbols. But like any wrongs, some gestures are a start. Sometimes the gestures are a start. If we start with recognition, it doesn't help to stop the erasure, but it does begin something. So in that way, if we start with recognition, stop the erasure, tell the stories, we can begin the repairs. As with any issue involving race and history, it's always complicated, but we owe it to ourselves and subsequent generations to get it right. I grew up with lies about my history, and I prefer my kids not to grow up with similar lies. I prefer the truth be told, even if it's uncomfortable, for my kids and every subsequent generation to follow. By celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, we can start along that path of education, wisdom, and ultimately peace. Thanks.
If you want to stand and turn to 116 in your hymnal, and we will share a song together. And in closing, may we leave a little bit more wise. May we leave a little bit more curious. And may we come back together as a community once again with more knowledge and understanding of one another and those we don't yet know. Go in peace and be well.